Well, good afternoon. Welcome back. We have a tough act to follow after this morning's panel, which I think gave us a feast to think about. But this afternoon, we're going to try to look ahead at some of what comes next with the overall theme of reconciliation, rebuilding, but also what different sectors of the society, and particularly civil society, the churches, possibly the universities, will be contributing in the future. I'm Catherine Marshall. I'm at the Berkley Center, and we're very honored to have a remarkable panel today. So we have Archbishop Gujak, who is the Archbishop Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Catholic Archpashi of Philadelphia. And he served as the founder and rector and is now the president of the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. So next we have Cyril Hoveron, who I'm not even going to try to pronounce this. This is the Archimandrite.
Kind of.
Roughly correct.
Yeah.
Who is a professor of ecclesiology and international relations and ecumenism at the Sankt Ignatius College, University College Stockholm, and director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And finally, we have Pavlo Esmitsiuk, who is the Mary Seeger O'Boyle postdoctoral fellow in Hellenic Studies and Religion at Princeton University. And previously, he was the director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies and a senior lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University, also in Lviv. So we have different perspectives, I think with a sort of bias towards the religious. But we'll start with Archbishop Gujak. And you have introductory comments, five or so minutes that will set the stage. We'll have a series of exchanges among us. I welcome you to challenge each other as well as my role. And then we'll open up for questions from all of the audience. So,
thank you, Professor. Can you hear me? I'd like to begin by expressing gratitude. I just returned from Ukraine, and young people and older people, politicians, people in the church, students, grandmothers, the church lady at the Orthodox Church of St. Andrew's in Bucha, behind which the mass graves were found in spring last year. All of them asked me to thank Americans for their prayers, advocacy, and humanitarian support. And I want to thank Georgetown University, which has, in this year, done a lot to bring forward, I think, a critical discussion on this war in Ukraine. Especially, I want to thank you, Tom, and everybody, all your colleagues, José at the Berkley Center, because this is not the first of these kind of convocations and discussions that you are hosting. I think they're very important. They are particularly important in this city. We are asked to speak about peace and reconciliation, and maybe I will use my introductory moment to remind ourselves mutually of what Ukraine's intentions are. There's a war in Ukraine, and the question is, what do Ukrainians think of peace? I had the opportunity to speak with Pope Francis for an hour and a half on August 26th. And he found it important to be reminded of the fact that in 1994, Ukraine, along with Kazakhstan and Belarus, became the first countries to give up their nuclear arsenal. It's a dream of peacemakers to have nuclear disarmament. It is a top goal. It is something that is so difficult. But 3 countries made this move, and they did it unilaterally. And it was accepted by society. And there was not many misgivings in what is now subsequently 30 years. Although now there are many thoughts about whether it was the right move. The fact that something was done cannot be emphasized enough. Giving up a nuclear arsenal. Nobody ever did it before, and nobody ever did it since. I think in the language of the Holy Father, the Holy See, the Church, peacemakers, the fact that Ukraine gave up nuclear arms should be mentioned in every discussion of peace or war in Ukraine. But it did not only that, it had about 900,000 soldiers in 1991, close to 1 million. That number was reduced on paper, was reduced to 150,000 on paper, of which only 15,000 were battle ready in 1994. 2014. It is a country that for a quarter of a century, or at least almost a quarter of a century, in its first steps, in its first impulses, in its first years, in its first decisive gestures, decided to disarm, give up nuclear arms, lessen its army, with a great hope for a democratic and peaceful future. That was the basic position of political establishment, and that was something that was embraced and supported by the population. Today, Ukraine is a country that is enduring an unprovoked invasion with well-documented war crimes and crimes against humanity. I won't go into all the statistics. I think this audience knows. Since October 10th, there's been an intensified attempt to terrorize the whole population, and civilian infrastructure has become a prime central target with over 60,000 homes destroyed, with 40% of the electric grid knocked out on the eve of winter. So what can churches do regarding peace and reconciliation? Well, I think it's very important to define and have churches help define what peace and reconciliation in concrete circumstances are. When our Lord wanted to teach about love, what is love of neighbor, he told a story about a man on a trip who was attacked, stripped, robbed, beaten, and left half dead. And a priest went by, a Levite, and it was only a person that saw his concrete wounds who took him into the inn, who left money for his therapeutic care, that was put forth as an example. And Jesus' example says that our love, our peacemaking, our reconciliation has to be concrete. It can't be abstract. It can't be theoretical. And Pope Francis has been speaking and gesturing and encouraging the world to be that way. One of his first gestures was to go to Lampedusa or touch the man with the disfigured face. He has chided, particularly us bishops and clergy, not to be moralistic or abstract, but to be very concrete. The answer for peace will come through intimacy with the victim. It will come through an understanding what justice means in these circumstances. And the churches are there, they're close. The clergy are in the field. Bishops and priests, I can speak for my church, are in place. For example, in Kharkiv, 2 of our bishops are there distributing food in the humanitarian aid lines, listening to people, not walking past, not leaving, but tending to the wounds. They give great inspiration. They give great trust. Because ultimately the Lord calls us to a peace that needs to be deep inside. It's not real, it's not a fulfillment of the Lord's ultimate desire unless we have peace in our hearts. And the irony is that that's often difficult to have. You can live in a country without war, but you can live in great anxiety, in great fear, which generates often aggression. I think in our polarized society, we can understand that quite easily. So just to begin, I think our reflection needs to be on what the churches are called to do, what our Lord calls the churches to do. And we will never go wrong when we are concrete in the charity. And that, I think, can be a point of the departure for the discussion, and I will, gladly elaborate.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions already, but let's turn to the other panelists. So, Archie Mandright Hovaron, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think to handle this situation, to address, to confront the war, we need to understand the nature of this war. And without religion or the distortion of religion, we cannot properly understand this war. In a sense, in my own opinion, the 24th of February 2022 was similar to 9/11 in a sense, that in both cases we had tragedies provoked by the misuse, abuse of religion. When a venerable tradition was distorted, was misinterpreted, and weaponized in order to harm people. As a result of 9/11, we witnessed a surge of the studies relevant to Muslim tradition, to Islam, to what Islam is per se, how Islam understands itself, and how Islam has been weaponized by the political ideologies. I think something similar is ahead of us regarding the Eastern Christian traditions, because in a very similar way, the Eastern Christian traditions have been weaponized, have been instrumentalized, and used against human life and human dignity. Even though I personally believe, and I think this belief is shared by many, that these traditions per se, they are probably one of the best advocates for human dignity and human life. So what we are dealing with in the case of, of the ideology that underpins the war in Ukraine, we are dealing with the distortion of the tradition, which goes in a completely different opposite direction. It's just like to turn something which is white into something which is black. And I hope that as a result of that, we will observe a rise in the studies of Eastern Christianity in different contexts. This war demonstrates that religion matters. It may matter in different ways. When religion is ignored, it comes back, but in the way we don't like it to come back. That's why it's much better to deal with religion and to study religion, to appreciate religion as it is, not in the way how it is interpreted or distorted, by those who use it with evil intentions. The way how this really, our tradition, Eastern Christian traditions, in a sense, we all represent Eastern traditions here, right? In different ways, we the panelists. This tradition has been weaponized, has been instrumentalized, has been transformed into something which it is not. I call this the substitution of theology with ideology. When theology is lacking, when theological understanding of the tradition is lacking, then it is substituted with the ideological perception. Look at Putin. Putin started this war in Ukraine. If you remember his speeches before the war, on the eve of the war, he preached as a historian. Of course, he was an amateur historian, not the kind of historians that we had in the panel here. I wish he had some, lectures from the panelists. But he was really an amateurish historian who believes that he is really the historian. He is the one who can interpret, the entire continuum of the Russian history and or the Ukrainian history, whatever. And he ends this war. If you take his sermons, because he preaches actually, all his public speeches nowadays are sermons. So the sermon that he preaches now, if you look at his public speeches that marked the anniversary of the war, the State of the Union kind of address to the Russian Federation, to the gathering of the Russian Federation, this time he was preaching not history, but theology, a sort of theology. Well, when he confusingly and clumsily accused those who believe that God is without gender as being, biased ideologically. Apparently he believes that God has a gender and he's a male, whatever. And the next day he also addressed a huge crowd in the Olympijski Stadium in Moscow. And he said, look, we, fatherland, well, he used this word, Отечество, fatherland is important and it is connected with the Father, God the Father, whom we address in Lord's Prayer. So that was another theological statement that he made. And we are dealing with someone who never studied history in the first place and never studied theology and tries to do both history and theology. And he does so so unprofessionally and so dangerously. By the way, as a footnote, I just want to say that is the proof why humanitarian studies are important in the university curricula, because Putin studied in the University of Leningrad, Leningradsky Universitet. He was was trained as a lawyer, but apparently the humanitarian component in the curriculum in the Leningrad State University where he studied was really weak and limited. That's why we have Putin, people like Putin, because of the unrepresented humanitarian studies in the curriculum. But it's just a footnote. My point is that now, on behalf of the church, on behalf of the tradition, those people speak who have no slightest clue about this tradition, and still they try to represent it. They effectively contribute to this war with those ideas. And my formula for this war is very simple. It's weapons plus ideas. In my own interpretation, the war is, I like to represent the war as it's like a grenade or a mine with a fuse inside it. So the explosive material within the mine, it's like weapons. They actually kill people, right? But in order to explode, a mine needs to be fused. And the ideas are the fuse within the mine. So if you remove the fuse, the mine is just a piece of iron and other chemicals. They cannot harm people, those mines. It is the fuse which is the crucial part of this explosion. In the case of Putin's ideology, which I call Putinism, in this case, the ideas are crucial. That's why in dealing with this war, I think it's important to deal both with the weapons. It's important to supply weapons to Ukraine. It has been mentioned, and I completely agree as a clergyman, that weapons are absolutely crucial for Ukraine to survive. That's a condition sine qua non for us, for anything else that we can do or we can't. But it's not just the weapons that need to be taken into consideration. It's also ideas, and in my judgment, it's primarily the ideas. This war started not in February 2022. It did not start even in February 2014, as most Ukrainians believe. It started much before that, prior to that, when those ideas were forged together into the ideology that became explosive. This war will not end with the defeat of Putin, will not end with the defeat of Russia. It will end, and we will have a sustainable peace in Europe and in the world, when the ideas that inspire, that underpin this war, will be deconstructed and condemned. As some time ago, the World War II did not end with the death of Hitler. And the sustainable peace came to Europe only after Nazism, the ideology that had underpinned Hitler's regime, was deconstructed and condemned. So we are facing the same kind of situation. We need to address Putinism even more than we address Putin. This is a formula of sustainable peace, speaking and on the top of what Vladika Boris has said about peace in Ukraine, the conditions for peace. That's one of the most crucial conditions for peace, I think, to tackle the ideas. And I think, dealing with the weapons, with the Russian weaponry, military machine, it's a military undertaking, task. To deal with the ideas, with Putinism, it's an intellectual process. It's something that we are called to do. The battlefield is the main place where the weapons are defeated. The universities are the main place where the ideas are defeated, or the ideas are articulated in order to help peace to flourish. That's why universities are crucial. That's why the places like this one will be crucial in bringing up and sustaining peace in Ukraine. That would be my kind of short introduction.
Thank you. Dr. Ismatyuts, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. 8 years of my education or deformation was in Jesuit institutions, so it's really an honor to be here at Georgetown. So at this stage of war, reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia might be precautious. But I think, of course, Chechens can think about it and prepare themselves to that task. And I would like to bring 3 points how they can do this. I think they should deal with hatred and collective blaming. They should reflect on peace building, reconciliation, and forgiveness. And they also keep their autonomy. So first, I think they need to help saving Ukrainians from hatred, stop hatred conquering the hearts of Ukrainian people. At the beginning of the Second World War, Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky was an Archbishop of Lviv, famous for saving many Jews during the war. He said, I quote, "Wartime makes it difficult for a person to follow the instructions of a sober, clear mind, enlightened by faith. Feelings, vulnerability, passion take over." And I think today Ukrainian churches, Ukrainian intellectuals can help resisting both collective blaming of Russians for the aggression against Ukraine and resist dehumanization of the adversary. Many Ukrainians consider Russians to be collectively responsible for this war. And I think there are serious grounds for this. At a certain point, 80% of Russian population supported this war. Very few Russians have protested. I think no bishop inside Russia has raised his voice against the war. And citizens are responsible for what their countries are doing. Hannah Arendt has argued that under dictatorship there is no office or job that in some way does not sustain the regime, from primary schooling to sports or journalism. But to blame everybody means that we make them lose their agency. And we stop distinguishing between those Russians who fled Russia, who were protesting and sometimes with risks to their freedom, put in jail or paid fines, and those who actively or even tacitly supported the war, those who used Russian culture or Russian religion to promote, yes, this imperialist vision of Russia. So if we don't make this distinction, the concept of guilt and responsibility becomes absurd. As Arendt says, where all are guilty, no one is. When in the 1930s, during Ukrainian-Polish conflict, the Polish authorities blamed all the Ukrainians for acts of sabotage and terrorism against the Poles, Ukrainian bishops, Sheptytsky and others, have issued a statement against the concept of collective responsibility. Today, the situation is very different, but I think the principle still holds. Responsibility lies with individuals. It is a choice that every Russian must make. And when one lives in a society where crime is the rule, then the lack of struggle against the system is already something that makes you responsible. This war, as perhaps any war, also brings dehumanization. You stop seeing a human being in your enemy. That's why Putin speaks about fascists, Satanists in Ukraine, rather than speaking about killing his Orthodox brothers. Because it's more difficult, perhaps, to kill your brother than to kill a fascist, yes, or Ukr, yes, the Russian elaboration of Tolkienian orcs. And I think some of Ukrainians also use similar tactics. So I think that by safeguarding individual agency and humanity of the adversary, churches can contribute to a future reconciliation. Second, I think that churches should reflect more on peace building and do it very concretely, as Archbishop Boris said. They need to prepare themselves for this. Although the war has been with us for 9 years, I think what has happened last February was a huge shock, and we haven't been prepared for this. Our churches enjoy an amazing level of popular trust, and they can use this advantage point to push forward some ideas about peace building and reconciliation. But I think they also need to learn to acquire some vocabulary, some competences. Let me give you an example. We have in Ukraine an amazing forum, All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. And I know José, Serhii have praised this organism a lot. It unites the leaders of all major Ukrainian churches and religions. In 25 years of its activity, the Council has published around 150 documents or statements. And I think 25 documents are against gender ideology, which is called a national security threat for Ukraine. I think around a third of them are on family values and 3 on peace building and reconciliation. Yes, I think it shows that we need slowly to change our focus. Yes, bioethics is beautiful, but it's not the only thing in social doctrine, social teaching that we should be concerned with. There was a moment in the revolution of dignity at Maidan when opposition didn't want to negotiate anymore with President Yanukovych. The square was tired of those endless negotiations. And then the church leaders of Ukraine went to the opposition, told them, you go and still keep negotiating, and we will talk to the people and convince them. And they do this at the end. And this is to show that Ukrainian churches have this advantage of popular trust, and they can push some ideas that now seem unpopular and might seem unpopular at the end of the war. And the last third point is that the churches, in order to be able to promote actively reconciliation and the end of this war, should remain autonomous, should be free, should not be just the messengers of the governments. And I think Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church did a lot on that by criticizing the idea of banning the Church of Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, by being against the creation of a state church in Ukraine. This is very important. And I think Georgetown, other universities, Christian charities should help Ukrainian churches, Ukrainian institutions in developing this language and this approach of peacemaking. And we are part of global Catholicism, as José says. We can bring the experience of conflicts in other countries, the lessons learned from wars in Latin America, Africa, in the Middle East, to Ukraine, and serve one of the bridges between Ukraine and the world. And here, I think, is a huge field for cooperation. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you all three for your very thought-provoking introductions, which I do think underscore how difficult it is now to talk about peace and reconciliation in the midst of the bitterness of conflict. Bishop Godsuk, I think you focused on 2 things. One is sort of the values that religious institutions bring for peace, which I always think is striking, that we're also looking at some of the virtues and values that go, ironically, through history and war, courage and sacrifice, and need to flip those into, or make them more, I think, the virtues of peace. But perhaps you could also speak about the tensions that this has exacerbated within the religious communities, and how reconciliation and looking towards a new beginning might happen both within the institutions within Ukraine, but also in the broader global churches that I think you are very much part of.
Well, I think the subject of peace in Ukraine is not just the question of what the churches in Ukraine do. The ideology that Archimandrit Kirill was speaking about is something that has been fostered to a great extent by the Russian Orthodox Church through a concept originally, I think, formulated by a philosopher, but then quickly adopted and elaborated as a program for the future some 15 years ago. Something to be used by the church and something that Putin adopted as well. And the great tension, first and foremost, an explosive tension, which will explode sooner or later, is within the Russian Orthodox Church. Because you cannot have that kind of ideology, which has been publicly condemned by, I think, 2,000 Orthodox intellectuals, people here present. You can't have that ideology in a church that desires to follow the teachings of Jesus. There's an incredible tension in the Russian Orthodox community and in the community of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is in the jurisdiction of the Russian Patriarchate. It is the tension, the anxiety of having in one body, one soul, completely incompatible positions. And it is beginning to explode. So 2 weeks ago, Serhii Chapnin, who was the director of publications for the Moscow Patriarchate until a few years ago, wrote a letter to Russian Orthodox bishops saying, I know you. I write not to all of you, I write to each and every one of you. What you are standing with, what you are standing by, if not standing for, is deadly for the church. So the greatest source of tension is right now, if we speak about churches in this war, the greatest source of tension is this hypocrisy. In the Ukrainian context, since late November, early December 2013, the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, which Dr. Smitsnyuk referred to, has had a rather consistent position regarding war and aggression. And if you take those documents into account, there I think are many more than 3 on peace. Because these documents were against violence and against war. And from the first days of the Orange Revolution, all of these churches together said these tensions in Ukrainian society cannot be resolved by violence. No language should be used to manipulate a sense of division in the country, that there are 2 Ukraines, and that dialogue is a way to proceed. When you were referring to certain reactions in Ukrainian society, They occurred after 100 people were killed, in most of it in broad daylight with cameras running. It is very dangerous to remain abstract, and as, for example, there are certain movements in Italy, they say, well, you know, it's really too bad. The Russians want victory, the Ukrainians want victory, and we really want peace. Whether it was 30 years ago when Ukrainians gave up their nuclear arms, or whether it's the deepest desires of the heart of the 14 million people forced from their homes, Ukrainians want peace. It is now a time of reckoning, a time for examination of conscience of, for example, German leaders, but also French, Italian, and many others who, with cheap oil and gas and cheap labor from China, built an economy at the cost of principle. These questions are very, very complex, but they're all integrated. They're all part of one whole. And that is why looking just at symptoms, looking at a sore on a toe that stems from a cancerous condition throughout the body will hardly be helpful. In general, the churches in Ukraine, I think, have tried to say the right thing and do the right thing. There might be exasperated voices. There might be cries of almost despair in the light of the suffering. But our Lord on the cross also spoke words that express human despair. The discourse has to be very attentive to the victim. One of the greatest scandals in the history of the Catholic Church is the scandal of child abuse, brought to light only in recent decades. Human beings are not particularly evolutionary or devolutionary. These sins did not all of a sudden materialize in the 20th century. We are only discovering and focusing on them. And there was a period of confusion, well-intentioned therapeutical approaches, a period where shame dominated over the desire to speak the truth or to identify the truth. And then finally we came to a conclusion. Victim first. Victim first. It's not NATO. It's not, who knows what. Listen to the victim. If you have that point of departure, you're on the track of the Good Samaritan. If you want to know how churches should act, listen to Jesus. That is where you can come to understand the remedies for the tensions that might be in churches, between churches. I think we still have quite a way to go to have that kind of attentiveness. This is what I shared with the Holy Father in August. And others have too. And we see that there's a different language coming from the Holy See in the last 6 months. I'll stop here for that.
Dr. Hoveron, you've talked about Putinism as a focus of your discussion and about removing the fuse and about the importance of ideas. And it sounds as if you see the ideas of the path forward more in Russia than in Ukraine, in those areas. So maybe you could give us some ideas of where that might lead.
Right. Well, speaking about Putinism and deputinization, I think we should keep in mind that it's not just a Russian issue. It's not just about Russia, and it is not something that needs to be done by the Ukrainians only. It needs to be done internationally and ecumenically. That is really a great ecumenical opportunity, I think, for all of us. Even though Putin and his cronies and his supporters, including those in the church, in the Russian Orthodox Church, they distort the Orthodox tradition. But the way of healing, the way of or the effort to undo this distortion, to restore the tradition, is not just a responsibility for the Orthodox. I think it is a responsibility for everyone, for all traditions, for the Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants. Just as in the case of the Nazi ideology, which had been supported by, well, as we know, by some Protestant theologians, even some Catholic theologians. But the process of denazification of theology, of German theology particularly, which had contributed to Nazism, was done not just by German theologians, even though with their significant input. It was done internationally and ecumenically. Just like the international community, the global community helps Ukraine now to survive and to fight this war, we need a global ecumenical effort to tackle the ideology of Putinism, which is, yes, local, Russian, connected with the Orthodox tradition, even if in this distorted way. But this particular case of, I call it totalitarian theology, this particular case of totalitarian theology needs to be deconstructed by people and places like this one, and other places like this one, like Georgetown University across the globe. So that's kind of one thing. Then another thing is what role should be played by Ukraine? Well, in Ukraine, a major crisis, they usually provoke important theological splashes. Fortunately or unfortunately, but this is a matter of fact, is that all the tragedies, Ukrainian tragedies during the 20th century, including Holodomor, including the Stalin's cleansings, including the conflicts that we had with Poland, for example, those Wisla operation and other pages in our history, they provoked a lot of historical studies, and they have been mentioned in this panel early in the morning. But they haven't provoked any significant theological reflection in the sense of public or political theology. If you take, for example, the modern political theology, either Catholic or Protestant, their roots are in the efforts to overcome Nazism and totalitarian theologies connected with the World War II. This theology after Auschwitz, for example, it's an example of this sort of new political theology or theopolitical thinking that emerged after the World War II. Vatican II, in a sense, was also a reaction to the World War II. It was an attempt to overcome the theologies that had underpinned. Now, from the Catholic side, like Mussolini's regime, for example, and other, what I think Father Sturzo in Italy called Cristofascismo, or clerico-fascismo. That was a reality. You know it better than me. And Vatican II tried to overcome that. that kind of theology. We in the Orthodox Church, we never had an opportunity. Well, we had many opportunities, but we missed every single opportunity to articulate our own theology in reflection of what we experienced in the past. We haven't produced, and this is something that we as a Ukrainian community failed to do. We haven't produced a theology after Holodomor, as the theology after Auschwitz was produced. We failed it, both in Ukraine and in the diaspora. It's overdue, and now it's an opportunity for us to catch up, to summarize all those tragedies. Well, on the opportunity of this war, it's time to really to produce a sort of Ukrainian public theology, political theology, which would reflect on all those events of the 20th century and on this war. So that is a task for us, which has not been accomplished yet.
Well, we're coming close to the time when we'll be opening up for questions. But meanwhile, Dr. Esmitsiuk, can you help us to sort of situate this discussion in the context of looking to reconciliation with the different sectors of society, including churches, civil society, universities, in other words, beyond the political leaders, the government leaders? What do you see as at least thinking towards next steps, even if the next steps are premature?
So I think there is a need for reconciliation which can happen already now. And you see this, for example, among two Orthodox jurisdictions in Ukraine. Just a short introduction. Ukraine has two major Orthodox churches, one that is independent or autocephalous, which has been recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 2019. And then there is another church, which was part, or maybe still is part, it's debatable, of the Russian Orthodox Church. There have been intentions. There hasn't been a lot of dialogue between them. I think Father Hovorun, when he was, 7, 8 years ago in Ukraine trying to launch the dialogue, and the punishment was to be sent to Russia for that. There is a dialogue between those two churches happening now. The hierarchy is not very interested, but lay people, clergy, priests are interested and are starting to speak. And I was afraid that the war can, yes, as in the quote of Sheptytsky, it can be a moment when emotions can take over rationality. I was afraid that the war can provoke major conflicts between two jurisdictions with violence, and thanks God this didn't happen. And I think that's a credit to Ukrainian patience and civility. Really, they were able, although in disagreement, although the church that has belonged or stopped belonging to Moscow Patriarchate is complicit to a certain degree in this Russian world ideology, in claiming that Russians, Ukrainians are the same nation, and that's why Ukrainians have no right for a sovereign state, etc. This church hasn't been made target of violent attacks. So I think this is a level of reconciliation that is already happening, and I hope it will be successful. The war brought amazing unity between different segments of society, even politically. You know, Zelensky didn't have all that support in Ukraine before the war, but I think people are trying to really bring all the resources together in this struggle. I think in an ideal world, a Russian Orthodox Church would be an ideal agent of reconciliation post-war, because they have parishes both in Russia and Ukraine, but they have become to such a degree a slave of state, of Russian state propaganda. They lost agency. They really can't play this role. And I think my fear is, so I don't see who on the Russian side can be, you know, a possible interlocutor in the future once the war is ended. We have some people who left, intellectuals, yes, as Serhii Chapnin, whom Archbishop mentioned, some opposition in Russia that has been jailed and has condemned this war. But I think it will be a big challenge with whom to speak afterwards.
I'm interested, Melanne Verveer was talking about the remarkable transformation of women's roles in diplomacy. Do you see that as having a major role?
So I think in Ukraine, you see, one of the perhaps mistaken understandings of what is going in Ukraine and which has been promoted by Russian propaganda is that what is happening, that this conflict is sort of a big civil war. This conflict is a result of an internal Ukrainian struggle. I think it's an inaccurate picture. So we have a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So I think the possible interlocutors will be between Ukrainian and Russian politicians. Now, I don't know, but maybe it's just my ignorance whether we have any women movements that are part of it. Certainly, if I can remember from after the Afghan war, the Soldiers' Mother organization in Russia was a huge force for justice, for peace, and also for democracy. I wonder whether something like this will be born in Russia eventually, and one could talk to them. But I have also seen recently the tendencies of Russian government sort of to make their own fake organizations of women who lost their kids or husbands in war. So we need.
So it's complicated.
It's complicated, and I think it's too early to judge. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see what questions we have from the audience. I see a hand right over there.
Hi, my name is Mikhailo Vinnytsky. I'm from Kyiv Mohila Academy. I have a question, and I want to thank all the panelists because my question, I was thinking of addressing it to one person, but you've all mentioned things that are probably relevant to this question. The first thing that was mentioned is the need for an ideology of peace or an ideology of reconciliation. And I think that one of the things that we have come to in Ukraine is that although peace is obviously desirable, peace must be just. And I think the question of a just peace was something that was brought up very specifically last Easter when Pope Francis had the initiative of the Ukrainian and the Russian woman at the Stations of the Cross and trying to sort of equate the two. And that created a significant uproar, certainly in Ukraine and beyond Ukraine, of effectively sort of equating the aggressor or symbolically at least equating the aggressor and the victim. When I come to the question of peace, or rather just peace, I'm sorry for this question being a little bit philosophical, but we are all very positive about the idea of a collective agency when it does good. So in, for example, social movements, that's very good when there's a collective agency, right? When we analyze social movements, we see positive aspects and communitarian ethics and that sort of thing. But when we speak of a Russian collective responsibility, we revert to the sort of the doctrine of evil as being something that is a deficiency of the individual. And I ask this because Vladika Boris and I had a brief conversation in Lviv where I asked him about the question of does evil exist as a sort of a separate ontological category? And the answer was no, because it's a characteristic of individuals that have an absence of good. And I asked that whether this is part of the ideology of what we can bring out of this war. That in addition to having a collective agency that we consider good, perhaps we should also be looking at the idea of a collective agency, meaning a collective responsibility for evil. That's more of a statement, but it's also something to think about, and I think I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts.
Did you have someone you wanted to respond. Okay, so over to you.
I remember we had a conversation in a panel format, I think. I didn't remember the exact question, and I wonder if that is my exact answer. I think that is one part of the explanation of evil, but I think evil has not just it's somewhere in between, or it's an absence of good. I think there's an incarnate quality, which is satanic. Nobody other than Pope Francis has warned Catholics not to underestimate the power of the devil, and in no uncertain terms, as he said, that it is very, very dangerous to negate the existence of the devil, of Satan. The question, of course, the danger is to identify anybody with Satan. And I don't think you need to do that to explain the evil. You don't have to demonize Putin. You just look at a progressive trajectory of a lifetime, a teenager who wanted to join the KGB before he could do so officially. Then a fundamental option, as Catholic moral theologians say, for a certain way of life, a certain vocation, a certain formation that sought the capacity to manipulate, to lie effectively, and to put aside all moral considerations in pursuing a goal. And that is something that the great tragedy, not only for Ukraine, but for Russia, is that not exclusively, but in the person of the leader of Russia, you have somebody that has been basically one track. And the capacity to kill has only grown. That, for me, is a rather clear example of being in the clutches of the devil. Is it possible to step back? Of course it is. But it's very difficult. It isn't possible if there's no desire to do so. In extreme cases of dependencies, for example, on alcohol or drugs, or on other vicious, say, practices or addictions, argument, often reason, does not have much effect. One has to hit bottom. And I don't know if Serhii Chapnin, is having hiccups now, but I will quote him again. You were there when he said it at table. He said, I think Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church has to collapse before there will be any possibility of reform. Now, does that mean that one can hope for and expect a repetition of what happened to Nazi Germany? Probably not. Probably 11 time zones of Russia will not be under full occupation. Maybe that's not desirable. But I think the basic modality of conversion often requires the experience of the prodigal son. You have to fall into the mud. You have to lose. You lose much or even everything. In 1991, at that time, not only President George Bush Sr., but leaders like Margaret Thatcher were straining their resources and using their energies to keep the Soviet Union together, because they could not see a future if, for example, this arsenal of the Soviet Union was divided among countries. They, for example, could not foresee that Ukraine might unilaterally disarm itself of nuclear arms, and Kazakhstan and Belarus. The realist politicians or political science like John Mearsheimer, they don't see moral moments. It's power and money. There's no grace. There's no real conversion. It's only what you're forced to do, or what you keep somebody from doing by your own force. But we see history is different. The Soviet Union indeed did collapse. And it wasn't a cataclysm. It was an incredible, exhilarating liberation for millions, tens of millions of people. 15 countries came out of it. And for at least a decade or two, much of the world breathed with a sigh of relief. I think Russians historically will need to ask themselves, why did we not use that great opportunity? This idea that the West humiliated Russia is, I think, on the part of Russians, is a supreme act of irresponsibility, and on the part of the West is some kind of transference or something. I don't know psychologically how to explain it. The Soviet Union did fall apart over 30 years ago, and 12 months ago, Ukraine did stand up against all odds. It's really striking. I've been in Ukraine 6 times, traveling in different parts of the country, not all parts. I wasn't speaking with the men on the front, but their attitude is quite clear, I think, to the whole world. Nowhere in Ukraine or in the 10 countries where I visited refugees were not a single person that I met was saying we need to give up. We need to make a compromise. We need to give up some territory. Are there people like that? Of course, I imagine there are. But last week's poll says the Ukrainians, 95% of Ukrainians trust in a victory. What that victory means is probably, it has many different definitions. But there is something when you have a history of genocide, multiple genocidal wars, when you have come to a historical consciousness and understanding in schools, and et cetera, that when the stories in your family can finally be freely told, that up to 15 million people were killed or died a natural death between 1914 and 1950. That's more than 1,000 a day for more than 35 years, just 1,000 a day, just like every day. When you see what Bucha, Irpin revealed, when you speak to Taira, Yulia Payevska, the medic who heroically saved Russian lives. There's a body cam that she wore, and there's ample footage of her saving the lives of Russian wounded POWs. And then she ended up in Azovstal, became a prisoner of war, and was tortured for 3 months. When you talk and listen to these people, you realize, any talk of peace with Putin, who has violated every single agreement with Ukraine. And the violations include a mass invasion, which probably now has a toll of between 200 and 300,000 deaths. 4 times as many soldiers that have been killed have been injured. 14 million people have been forced from their home. How can you talk about anything with this man? How can you induce people to talk to this man? All the fundamental options, everything that he said explicitly for 20 years, all this wishful thinking. I sat next to Tony Blair in Davos, and he was kind of basically agreeing. We weren't listening to him because he said, I told President Putin, we're not going to force Ukrainians come into the European Union, but we're not going to force them out either. Let the Ukrainians decide. And Putin told him, no, they're not going to decide. And he said, no, you know what I mean. We're not going to force them to join the Union. He said, no, they're not going to decide. This was 2004. Then he told President Bush in 2006, they're not a country. Then he invaded in 2014. Well, he wiped out Frank, I said, the capital, Grozny in Chechnya, wiping out countless Russians. Then he came with the invasion of eastern Ukraine to save the Russian speakers and our Orthodox people. And who is being killed? Predominantly Russian speakers and members of the Moscow Patriarchate. Mariupol, the city of Mary, which was leveled. We don't know whether there are 10,000 or 100,000 people killed in that city. It was the most Russian-speaking city in the world. So I think all discussion of peace, all prompting to negotiation must be concrete. You have to know who you're talking to. You're talking with a mass murderer who is, in the last 2 months, sent 40,000 of his own citizens as cannon fodder in a cynical move, having no regard for human life of prisoners. We'll empty our prisons. It'll reduce the expenses that we use for So our ecclesial, theological, intellectual discussions have to be real. And evil does exist. And it has incarnate qualities. Nobody is Satan himself, but you can buddy up. And it's very sad when you start that fellowship. Things just go downhill. For you and for all those whom you touch.
Thank you. Did you want to add something quickly?
A short footnote, yes, to what Archbishop Boris said. So I understand, Michaela, your question and its importance. And I remember when Pope John XXIII published his Pacem in Terris encyclical on peace, he was criticized because he used a term, pacem, peace, that was sort of monopolized by the Soviets, who were building the peace, mir во всем мире, yes, the peace in entire world. And I think today, very often, the narratives about peace building are an instrument of those who don't want to support Ukraine, who are happy for Ukraine to surrender parts of its territory. So as everything, it can be an ideological, propagandistic concept, but not always and not necessarily. Peace, certainly, peace should be just. Like biblical concept of shalom is something that includes everything. So it needs to include justice. It needs to include justice toward the victims, and it can't be surrendering, Ukrainians in Donbass or Crimea to Russian oppression. And I think even in all sorts of concepts of reconciliation the idea of punishment is also included. Like Daniel Philpott, yes, who tries to push the idea of forgiveness into politics, even he says that punishment, restoration, repentance, apology are part of reconciliation. You can't have reconciliation without that. But they also add healing, that theology can add something that is not part of a political toolkit. Then collective responsibility. I think there is a sense in which you as a citizen, by paying your taxes, by doing well your job as a taxi driver or whatever, you are supporting the regime. So the Russians who don't protest, they are responsible for what their government is doing. But not every Russian is responsible. So Russians who rebel against that are not. And I invite, every Russian to stand against the war, even with some personal risks, and I'm sure the history will rehabilitate them and will make them right. That's the right approach. But if you say that every, bearer of Russian culture is complicit, I think it's a bit too far. And the last thing about terminology, when Pope Francis spoke about the war in Donbass, like before the full-scale invasion, as fratricidal, it was very criticized in Ukraine because that was repeating Russian propaganda, which claimed that Ukrainians and Russians are brothers, are members of the same nation, civil war. So from Christian perspective, of course, Ukrainians and Russians are brothers. Every human beings are brothers. So you have different levels of usage of terminology, and we should be careful about this instrumentalization by Russia and Russian propaganda, but by refusing the interpretations of Russian propaganda, we should not, also deny the possible, theological Christian interpretations of phenomena. With Via Crucis in Rome, and I think that wasn't very wise. Reconciliation cannot be imposed. Ukrainians will have an allergy toward reconciliation if it's being imposed onto them by the West or even by churches. So we can't play with that. And you need, as Bishop Boris says, hear the victim, respect the victim, and you cannot impose things onto the victim. They will need their time, or maybe they will never arrive to reconcile them with the aggressor. But we cannot impose this, that's for sure.
Thank you. We have only a few minutes, so if there are questions, let's at least get some questions out and then pursue them later in the day. So are there burning questions? I see two hands. I can barely see, but two hands at the back.
Hello again. Basically, they mentioned
Could you
peace.
introduce yourself? Sorry.
Augustus Salzona. I was here last year of May, and I was a senior foreign policy advisor, Trump for President campaign 2016, advised on social issues and all that, and unfortunately he didn't follow some of my advice, though we did get Roe v. Wade overturned. That being said, my question is this: there's one statement, "Sivus pacem parabellum." Those of you who know Latin should recognize that. The thing is this: there are two things. Basic question is this: the fundamental question is how many churches, Christian churches, whether Orthodox, Russian, or and especially Catholic churches, have been destroyed by any of the Russian their special forces, not the draftees, not the mercenaries who went in there, or not the Chechens who've got their axes to bear, etc. That's the first question. And then the second one is this. So one thing I want to say, I basically agree with most of what I've heard, and given my worldview, some of you may probably be surprised at that. But there is a book, Memory and Identity, which never made the New York Times bestseller list. It was published by Pope St. John Paul the Great in January of 2005, and then he lost his voice and then subsequently passed away. I think answers to a lot of the questions of what's going on, you can actually read it in that. It never made the New York Times bestseller list. It's not even available at the Opus Dei Center. But anyway, question is, what would isn't nationalism the key, and having leaders who are respected, they may be hated, but at least respected, or get the respect of the classic enemies of the West, or the current enemies of the West? And wouldn't there be a better choice for the president of Ukraine rather than the current occupant, who, quite frankly, I don't see how anybody in the West except the globalists can possibly consider him credible?
Thank you. I saw another hand at the back, or I see two, and then we're going to have to end the panel. Yeah. If you can get the microphone to the hands.
Okay.
And if you could be quick, because
And I'll be very quick. I just want
if you could introduce yourself.
Frank Sysyn, and pursuing this issue of reconciliation. I think one of the last points made on the dangers of propagation of reconciliation without consideration of the victim, which we heard about, is a tremendous problem. The question is, how indeed has anyone been able to work out a way in which groups external can find ways to be helpful in reconciliation and not seem to speak with a condescending voice? We ran a session on reconciliation in Lviv. José and I were involved in it, in which there were German scholars speaking about the Holocaust and Spanish scholars who wanted to speak about the Spanish Civil War, and a Ukrainian audience. And it was like three solitudes of Germans who had somehow felt that they had the key to all understanding, of Spaniards who wanted justice and truth above all before they could begin, and of Ukrainians who had not even begun the path of considering how they were going to go on to it. So it didn't work as a dialogue. I wonder, once you enter the theological factor, do you have specific cases where it has worked? And do you think that attempts that are being made by organizations such as the Berkley Center and groups outside really can be effective at this point and have been somewhere?
Good question, and we'll have the last final voice from the back.
Thank you, Esteban from the SFS, a master student. Thinking about your words, Bishop and Archbishop, in the Colombian case, when we have all this conflict, all the atrocities, we have the True Commission and all the healing process of the reconciliation, where especially because stay in the side of the victims. I was thinking about how preserve the testimonies that you are listening, or the people that are really in touch with the victims, for a future True Commission in Ukraine. Something try to help them, because there is no other way to get like the fair justice for the victims if you don't listen closely to them. This is like one of the learnings of a Jesuit, the Father Francisco de Rue, when we learned in Colombia, because even for the transformation of the perpetrators, the listen of the victims are like fundamental. There are no other way to heal the future of these atrocities.
Well, thank you so much for these questions, which I'm sure everyone is burning to answer, but we can't do it right now. So let me conclude very briefly. I think Bishop Gutzak began with talking about the values of peace. And I think that idea, that love, that passion, the focus on the victims, the focus on hope, really did permeate much of the discussion. But we also saw the great difficulty in thinking that far ahead while we're in the midst of the storm, of the horrors of what is happening on the ground. So I thank you for your good-willed, wise, and thoughtful provocations and ideas, and look forward to continuing the discussion.